Introducing our next speaker, Elan McAllister.
Well, I want to start by expressing my gratitude to all of you. Thank you so much for being here tonight and for creating a safe space to support all of us as we come out here and face our fears, birth our voices into the world, and stand for ourselves as leaders. Now, I'm used to being in your position. I'm used to being the support person. I'm used to coming in and creating a safe space where a woman can come in and go up against a really challenging situation, which is childbirth. I'm a birthing doula. I've been doing it for years, and I have seen so many things. I have seen incredibly beautiful, inspiring, absolutely awesome births. And on the flip side, I have seen births that in any other context would be considered abuse, where women have left feeling traumatized by their experience. And I've seen everything in between. And I would love to share a couple of these experiences with you. And don't worry, I'm not going to overshare. There will be no placenta smoothie recipes or anything like that. One of the first births that I attended was for a first-time mom. And it was late in her pregnancy. It was about in her eighth month. She took this really amazing childbirth ed class that totally changed everything for her, completely changed her perspective, and suddenly she absolutely knew that she wanted to have a natural birth. She was suddenly totally committed to this. Her obstetrician wasn't as sure, and the hospital that she was birthing in had about a 47% C-section rate. So she felt like she might need a little bit of help to navigate this situation. So she hired me. She hired a doula to come and help her. We arrived at the hospital when she was in labor to find out that her doctor was on vacation. And the OB that was going to be attending her was the only one in the practice that she'd never met before. As luck would have it, this was an elderly gentleman from the UK. And part of his training had been to follow midwives throughout his schooling. So he'd seen so many natural births, totally like normal physiologic births. And he was delighted. He was so excited. He'd been in New York for a couple decades, and he could count on one hand the number of natural births that he'd seen in that time. And he gave us all the space, all of the time, and all of the support that this woman needed to really find her rhythm, to get into her body, to feel her urges, and to follow every single gut instinct that came up for her. And when it came time to push, her body told her she needed to lay on her side. She just instinctively turned to her side. I held her leg. The baby came through with ease. The husband caught the baby and brought it right to her chest. And it was beautiful. It was peaceful. It was sweet. It was so easy. Cut to 2 years later, it's her second baby. She's moved to New Jersey. She has a new OB practice, a new hospital that she's birthing in. We're excited. You know, we've birthed together before. We're in a groove. She knows she can birth. We're having a good time. We come up on the elevator. We're belly dancing. We're laughing. The doors open. We step out, and it's like a scene from ER. Okay, people are running everywhere. They've got yelling at each other, lights and whistles, and a wheelchair comes. They whisk her off. She's in bed flat. She's got 10 machines attached to her. And suddenly, in the space of moments, she's been changed from a healthy, solid, strong woman going through a normal physiologic process into a patient. Okay, everyone in the room knows that she is a disaster just waiting to happen. This is an emergency situation, and they are there to make sure that she survives this. When it comes time for her to push, she goes to roll on her side, because that's what she knows. That's what her body does. She goes to roll on her side, and the 6 complete strangers in the room, the experts, start yelling at her. What are you doing? What are you doing? You can't do that. Babies don't come out that way. Stop it. You know, and they're talking to her, talking down to her like a child. Lay on your back. What are you doing? Finally, her obstetrician comes up into her face and says, Babies don't come out that way, dear. And when they do, they're damaged. Do you want to damage your baby? Same woman, 2 very healthy pregnancies, 2 normal labors, but 2 very different birth experiences. This culture of fear that her second birth took place in is the norm. This is what most women are experiencing right now in this country. And it's odd because it's at a time when childbirth is actually relatively safe. We have access to advanced medical care, to amazing surgeons. And yet this culture of fear is totally dominating our experiences. And it's gotten to a point where it's driven practice all the way to this extreme where we use medical interventions routinely, whether you need it or not. And this fear has very, very deep roots. It goes all the way back to the dawn of obstetrics, which is back in the Victorian age. Now, at that time, science was very, very clear. The male body was the norm. It was the prototype. And the female body was a lesser copy. And anything that happened in that female body that deviated from the norm was suspect. And it was pathologized. And we had to regulate it. We had to manage it. That meant menstruation, childbirth, and menopause. Okay? And we see that today. It's carried forward. It's so evident in our 40% induction rate, in our 33% C-section rate. The World Health Organization recommends a safe level of between 5 and 15%. We're 33%. There's so much evidence to show that you do more harm than good when you get above a 15% C-section rate. And we're spending more than twice per birth in this country than any other country does, and we don't have better outcomes. For industrialized nations, we are ranked last for maternal mortality and last for infant mortality. But we have very high rates of postpartum depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So as you can see, this is absolutely a reproductive justice issue. And as someone who was raised in a household of hippie counterculture feminists, I felt called at a pretty young age to address this particular injustice. I picked up a book on midwifery in my mid-20s, and I read The Midwife's Model of Care. And it was the purest, most beautifully iterated expression of feminism that I had ever come across. And it inspires me to this day. And I took that inspiration and I went and became a doula because I wanted to see birth and I wanted to see what's happening. And as I said before, I saw some really beautiful things. I saw what birth could and should be for every single woman. And I also saw what it far, far too often is. And those two visions together created the activist. And this activist created an organization called Choices in Childbirth. And our entire intention was to educate women about their rights and their options so that they could make informed childbirth decisions that were right for them. But something happened about 3 years ago. I attended a birth, and typically at the end of the birth, after the baby's been born, I'll stay with the mom. And I will sort of help her process right then postpartum. You know, we'll be processing just the whole event of birth, which is kind of extreme. So at this particular birth, I felt really drawn to the baby. And after he was born, he'd been moved across the room. He'd been put under, heating lamps in a little bassinet, and he was crying his head off. He was just crying his little heart out. And I felt so pulled to this little guy. And I went over and I put one hand on his chest and I cupped the other over his eyes and I just whispered to him. And I said, "You are so loved. You are so welcome. You did such a great job. I'm so happy that you're here. Your parents are so happy that you're here. You are safe." And he stilled immediately, and he stopped crying. And he turned his little face to me, and he looked right into me. And I had the most profound moment of knowing and connecting with the holiness of birth. Because I recognized that this little guy, he had one foot in this world, and he still had one foot in another world. He was in transition. He was still in the hands of God. And I could feel it. And I knew in that moment the full sacredness of birth. And I recognized that it matters. It matters how we come into the world. And that changed everything for me. It changed my work as an activist. It changed me as a woman. It changed my organization. I went from being angry and fighting for the rights of women to being inspired and having a vision of hope for our future. And for Choices in Childbirth, it shifted our mission completely. You know, we now have a mission of moving from fear and distrust around birth to moving to the sacredness of birth and making that paradigm shift, helping us all make that shift to knowing the importance of this. And what would it look like? What would it look like in the world if we all truly believed that the sacredness of birth? What would it be like for women? Any woman who went into labor, into the hospital, she would be so honored as the gateway to new life. She would be heard. She would be empowered. We would go out of our way to make sure that she not only had the safest birth, the healthiest birth, the most respectful birth experience, but also the most pleasurable birth. And what would it be like for babies? Instead of coming into a world where you were immediately separated from the people who love you the most, where you were isolated, where it was cold and loud, and the room was full of fear and distrust. Instead of that, you could come into an environment of love, where you were held, where you were wanted, where your first experience was of connectedness. And what would sacred birth look like for the family? I want you to go back to that second birth story that I told you about, where we walked out and it was like the set of ER, right? When it came time for that mom to push and she finally agreed to lay on her back, I looked up to the dad because I knew she was going to need some extra support through this. I knew she was going to be really disappointed. And I couldn't find the poor guy. He wasn't there. He wasn't where he was supposed to be. He was on a chair in the corner so that he could see over the 6 professionals in the room, so he could see the birth of his child. He was totally disconnected. In the first birth, he never left her side. In the first birth, he witnessed her in the fullness of her glory and her power. In the first birth, he caught the baby. His hands were the first hands to touch this baby's body. There is a sense that birth is a means to an end, that it's just something to get through. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of this process. Birth matters. How we each come into this world matters. Thank you.